Hi, I'm Mohamed Moti from the Sorbonne University and Saint-Antoine Hospital in Paris, in France. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this new activity by the International Academy for Clinical Hematology. In a letter to Robert Hooke in 1675, Sir Isaac Newton made his most famous statement: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Standing on the Shoulders of the Giants initiative by the IACH aims to celebrate the achievements of leading experts and investigators whose work and research have helped to significantly advance the field of clinical hematology and establish the milestones and foundations of modern clinical hematology. The IACH Scientific Steering Committee will choose the honorees from different fields of clinical hematology. All IACH members, friends, and supporters are also encouraged to propose names. The steering committee will ultimately choose among the proposed names based on each nominee's body of work, including strengths of research, clinical impact, significant educational contributions, and overall accomplishments. Our first honoree today is Dr. Rainer Storb, who you all know, I think, very well. But before starting the interview with Dr. Storb, I'd like to share with you a couple of videos.
I've been very fortunate to spend a research fellowship in Rainer Storb's lab at the IACH in the program Transplant Biology. Rainer Storb is the leading pioneer of allogenic stem cell transplantation. He has spent almost 60 years systematically performing experiments, first in the dog model and then doing clinical studies to first establish and then improve allogenic stem cell transplantation. He has a lot of major achievements. I'd like to name a few. Rainer Storb established a conditioning regimen for plastic anemia that is still in use worldwide today and allows up to 100% of patients to be long-term survivors. He also established a protocol for GvHD prevention in the beginning of the 80s by combining cyclosporin and methotrexate. That is still the gold standard in a lot of centers worldwide and significantly improved transplant outcome. In 1979, Rainer published a landmark paper where he could demonstrate the graft versus leukemia effect of GvHD, and this lay the back or the ground for cancer immunotherapy. And for that reason, we can rightfully say that allogenic stem cell transplantation is the first curative immunotherapy. Rainer was also working hard to reduce the toxicity of conditioning. So in the 90s, he drastically reduced the chemotherapy and irradiation doses and established the non-myeloablative conditioning. This regimen is based on the fact that donor immune cells in the graft rapidly eradicate malignant disease in the patient and rapidly establish donor chimerism. This protocol allowed thousands of patients worldwide to receive a transplant despite the fact that they had comorbidities or were older up till the age of 80. Rainer has a contagious enthusiasm about his research and stem cell transplantation. He has extremely high standards. So in the lab, he used to say, it's not good enough to be excellent. You have to be outstanding. Rainer is an outstanding physician scientist himself. He is data-driven. He has a remarkable memory. He can remember publications from decades ago, his own old lab data that he then combines with new developments to move the field forward. Rainer has many fantastic accomplishments, but he's also a leader in open water rowing. So on Monday mornings in the lab, the most important topic to be discussed was the rowing competition from the day before, where Rainer and his son Adrian usually defeated younger rowers easily. Rainer Storb is still actively in research. He is enthusiastic about all the new improvements and developments. He's an inspiring lecturer, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting him soon at one of the conferences when the pandemic is over. I would like to congratulate Rainer to all his fantastic achievements that tremendously moved the field forward in transplantation, and would like to wish him all the best for the years to come.
Professor Storb joined the group of Donald Thomas and Robert Epstein in Seattle to work in early development of bone marrow transplantation. When he joined the group, using his words, a very small group of cowboys, including himself, pioneered how to perform the procedure. Radiation of conditioning was administered in an old bunker of World War II, described by Dr. Storb as like the Dante's Inferno. Everything was new and investigated first in canine models before moving to human transplantation. All this pre-human work lasted like 7 years until transplantation in humans were performed in Seattle. The first patients were so close to the animal facility that they could hear the dogs barking. It has to be emphasized that Rainer Storb has been the main leader of most developments in transplantation field all over the world. Rainer Storb is also a long-time athlete that continues regularly rowing with his son and participating in open water races, in addition to other sports. The scientific and personal trajectory of Rainer Storb has also been possible thanks to the continuous support of his wife, Beverly, another outstanding scientist at the Hatch. Rainer, I am extraordinarily pleased for having the opportunity to send you this message.
For the past 20 years or so, Professor Storb has been one of the most cited and quoted physician scientists worldwide. And maybe most importantly, Professor Storb trained throughout the years numerous researchers and physicians, more than 130. Many of them have become leaders in the transplantation centers throughout the globe. Professor Storb has won numerous awards as recognition of his unprecedented contribution to the field of stem cell transplantation throughout his career, including the Alexander von Humboldt Award, the Joseph Steiner Award, the Gustav Kraus Prize of the German Academy National of Science, the Mayberg Prize, the Henry M. Stratton Medal, and the E. Donald Thomas Prize from the American Society of Hematology, the Joseph H. Buchnell Clinical Research Award from the American Association of Cancer Research, the Don Metcalf Lecture Award from the International Society of Experimental Hematology, and many others. Professor Storb continued to be an outstanding role model for physicians and scientists. He does not stop for a minute and is continuing his active research trying to further improve stem cell transplantation and make the procedure less toxic and more friendly. So it's a great honor for us at the International Academy of Clinical Hematology that Professor Storb accept to be our first giant on hematology, and we welcome Professor Storb. Congratulations.
But it is a tricky task to introduce someone who does not need any introduction. Each of you knows Dr. Rainer Storb. Each of you knows Rainer. No doubt that you are aware of his numerous contribution to the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation field over the last 50 years, and that your practice refers every day to at least one of them. I shall not review them, but for the late 60s, he delivered for each decade a substantial input. Each of these contributions have been a breakthrough in our field. The introduction of methotrexate, the improvement of transplant in aplastic anemia, or the optimization of graft versus host disease prevention with cyclosporin A, and more recently, the introduction of non-myeloablative conditioning that dramatically decreased transplant-related toxicity and paved the way to haplotransplant and transplant of older patients. The development of this last innovation is indeed still going on. From the mid-60s, Dr. Storb has been one of the major contributors of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. He continuously developed an endless back and forth work between the lab and the clinic, using canning model to test and optimize hypotheses before introducing them to human care through rigorous clinical trials and going back to the lab when needed. He has been and still is a major individuality in this seminal school of medical expertise where brain is never far from heart. Indeed, each of us who were trained at the Hutch has benefited from this eagerness to share the knowledge elaborated in this center. Many teams and institutions all over the world have benefited from this behavior, and Dr. Storb actively contributed to this. In this perspective, most of the trainees that worked over years under Dr. Storb and his team's supervision has successfully taken over and therefore brilliantly contributed to the field wherever they work. To conclude, Rainer, on the behalf of the worldwide transplant community and of the hematologists all over the world, and even more on the behalf of the patient who benefited from your contribution, I would like to thank you and express our deepest gratitude.
Thank you very much, Professor Kreinex, Sierra, Nagler, Blaise, for the nice statement. So, good morning, Dr. Storb. Everything has been said about your great achievements, actually, in the field, and we owe you a lot. But my first question is, I wonder if you can tell us something first about your early childhood, I would say, because everybody spoke about, transplantation and TBI and everything. Your early educational experience and how that might have played a role in your selection of the scientific and medical fields.
Well, actually, I'm not entirely sure whether the early childhood actually contributed. I grew up in fairly turbulent times, World War II, the post-war period. During the war, I grew up in a city that was heavily bombed. And since schools were all destroyed in the process, I was put into a small boarding school in the Bavarian Alps and was separated from my parents for quite a while. And when I came back, cities were destroyed. We didn't have school for the first year after the war because there were no buildings. So I'm not sure that actually contributed to the choice. I was innately just very curious about things, and maybe that was the motivating factor. I had the choice when I grew up in the post-war period. My choices were engineering, which was one fascinating field, or medicine, which was a family tradition. My grandfather was a surgeon, and my father was a general practitioner who had been served as a medic during the First World War in the Russian front, and then later established his practice. So it may have been the family tradition that motivated me to go into medicine. But when I then was in medicine, I recognized that I wasn't really cut out for daily seeing patients. I was becoming really curious about what was behind a disease status or disease phases and what was behind therapy. So I think that's what drove me into the medical sciences.
But was there any particular teacher, faculty in Germany or elsewhere that you thought at the time to be exemplary of the academic tradition, and these guys inspired you to and pushed you further?
Well, I did my last phases of my medical education at the University of Freiburg, which is in the southwest of Germany. And there, hematology was actually very much in the foreground. There was a very charismatic teacher, Heilmeyer, who stimulated me in becoming interested in hematology, especially in the bone marrow. And that's what motivated me to choose a internship and residency in Munich with another hematologist named Begemann. Neither one of them was a laboratory-based physician, but they definitely had a great interest in hematologic diseases. And when I then looked at postdoctoral fellowships, I actually looked outside of my country at Paris, where they were hematologists, and I applied to a NATO Science Fellowship, which I obtained, to work first at the Hôpital Saint-Louis under Jean Bernard on the more clinically oriented side. And then I went to work with Marcel Bessis at the National Transfusion Center, a laboratory-based research. And that's where I got really interested in basic laboratory-based research. And my focus was always on laboratory-based research that could be translated to help patients. So it was actually the stay in Paris that shaped my future outlook.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear this, and this is really very exciting. But what particularly about what was happening in Seattle actually attracted you to move there from your home country and from Paris, obviously?
Well, while I was in Paris, I realized that I didn't want to be devoting my life entirely to laboratory-based research. And while I was working with Marcel Bessis, we had a lot of visitors from all over the world coming to the lab, and I used the opportunity to speak to them. And it was very obvious that the only country at that time where lab work could be connected to research were the United States. And a German investigator named Ted Fliegner had worked for 9 years at the Long Island, at the Brookhaven National Laboratories on Long Island with Gene Cronkite. He came to the lab. He was on his way back to Germany, where he established a research facility at the University of Ulm. And he recommended that I contact 3 people. One was Fred Stolman in Boston. One was George Brecker at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. And then he said one who was really interesting is Don Thomas, who had just moved to Seattle. And then I went to the library. I looked at their publications, and I thought that Don was really the most interesting guy, and wrote to them, and they all had space in their lab. I then applied for a Fulbright scholarship, and I decided in the end to work with Don in Seattle. I had no idea where actually Seattle was, to be frank. And this was precipitated by an experience I had in Paris in 1964, when George Maté, whom I knew, set up a research conference on bone marrow and transplantation, where I met people like Dirk van Beckham from Holland, and I met, of course, George Maté, who organized the conference. I met Ernie McCulloch from Toronto. I met Emil Freireich, who was at the NIH, and Jacques Miller from Melbourne, Robert Good from Minneapolis. I met a lot of people, and I was just fascinated by the discussions these individuals had, heated discussions, heated disagreements on how the field actually would evolve and develop. And that made me decide to go to Seattle to Don Thomas, even though at the time, human bone marrow transplantation seemed to have failed. In fact, most people who were working in the field left the field dismayed and thinking this would never become really a medically useful procedure. But that's what actually fascinated me about it. And that's how I wound up, with the help of a Fulbright scholarship, which paid my way. Otherwise, I could never have made it there. I made my way to Seattle. I realized Seattle was actually on the west coast of the United States by that time. So, so one morning, or one evening rather, in September of 1965, I finally arrived in Seattle.
Wow. So today, when we speak about bone marrow transplantation, this is like part of hematology. So what was the structure of hematology, of the hematology field back then in the 60s, when you arrived in Seattle? Was there actually any department of hematology at this time? Did anybody call themselves a hematologist?
Yes, actually, in Seattle, there was the Division of Hematology, which was led by a then giant in hematology named Clem Finch, who worked in iron metabolism. And he had set up a small division, and he was the one who recruited Don Thomas from Cooperstown, New York, to come to Seattle. And Don's division was a subdivision of hematology. And the letterhead was supposed to say Division of Hematology and Transplantation. The UW, University of Washington Printing Office, made a mistake and called it the Division of Hematology and Transportation. So little was known at the time about the world of transplantation. So Don's division consisted, when I came, of Don Thomas himself, who was a full professor. Then there was an instructor in medicine named Robert Epstein, Bob Epstein, who became a really good friend and colleague. I was the senior research fellow. We had one secretary, Louise, I remember. We had one laboratory technician, Kathy. We had two animal technicians. One of them was Ted Graham, an ex-Marine sergeant who had traveled with the Thomases, with his family, from Cooperstown, New York to Seattle. And that was the Division of Hematology and Transportation. We weren't even located at the University of Washington campus. We were in a teaching hospital called the United States Public Health Service Hospital, which was about 7 miles south of the medical school, in an old hospital from the 1930s. We had a small laboratory up on the 10th floor of this building. The laboratory was just a couple of lab benches, essentially. We had a small office, and we had an animal laboratory on that same floor. There was only one other research unit in the building, Seymour Klebanov, who was an infectious disease researcher. So we were very isolated, actually. And when we wanted to go to the library, we had to travel 6.8 miles to the medical school. That's how we started. very primitive.
So that was the primitive PubMed. You had to go 6 miles to get to the library.
Yes, 6.8 miles exactly. And then we had, for most of our animals, we were given space in an abandoned World War II bunker, which was another 5 miles away in West Seattle, up on a hillside. And you had to go down really about 5 flights of stairs underground to get into the bunker, where we had this small animal breeding facility, and we had the total body radiation sources. So we were actually a division of transportation, because we had to drive all the time to get to our various laboratory spaces and to the library. Or if you wanted to go to seminars, which were at the medical school, we had to travel again another 6.8 miles to get there. So we were fairly isolated.
So I heard well that the division of hematology was focused on ion metabolism.
Correct.
Then you had the subdivision of transportation,
Yes.
where you were trying to find your way, and this is maybe can explain your physical, how keen you are on physical training and physical activity and sport. But then, can you talk a little bit about the sort of research and clinical problems people were debating in the field of blood and bone marrow disease at this time?
Well, you know, as I said, the human transplantation efforts were abandoned at the time when I came to Seattle. Nobody did human transplants. And so there was our small group in Seattle. There was another group on the other side of the United States in Baltimore, George Santos at Johns Hopkins, and he had an equally small group of investigators. They worked on monkeys. There was George Maté in Paris, who was highly innovative, but I think not all that well organized. He had a keen interest, and then there was Dirk van Beckum at the Rijkswijk Radiation Biology Institute. There were some individuals in the UK at the Harwell National Labs, Barnes and Laudit. They worked in mice. And there was John Trenton in Houston. And that was about, and then there were some people at the Oak Ridge National Labs, Charlie Congdon and Delta Uphoff. And those were the people working in the field, really. Except for George Santos and us, nobody really took an organized approach, working in the lab and hoping to apply the laboratory work to human patients. And our interests were patients with leukemia, of course, the patients with aplastic anemia, and patients with hemoglobinopathies. And so what Bob Epstein and I did was we sat down at the very beginning of my stay there and made a list of things that had gone wrong in the preceding attempts at human transplantation, starting with conditioning regimens, starting with tissue typing, which was then a big black box whereby the Europeans played a big role in eventually unraveling it. Jean Dossé at Paris, Jan van Rode in Leiden. And then we looked at graft versus host disease prevention. We were concerned about aplastic anemia patients becoming sensitized to their donors via transfusions, and many other things. And so we then systematically began animal experimentation to work out these problems. And it took us 5 years of intensive animal work to eventually get into the clinic. One thing we did was we wrote to veterinarians in the Western United States to send us dogs with spontaneous lymphoma. We said we would treat these dogs to the best of our knowledge, do either autologous or allogeneic transplants, and then send the dogs back to their owners. And this was a very, very helpful undertaking because we learned about autologous transplantation. We learned about graft versus tumor effects, which up to that time had only been once described by Barnes and Laudet in a 1956 publication in mice, although they didn't really quite know whether it was graft versus leukemia effect or whether the graft versus host disease seen in these mice provided an infertile ground for leukemia development. So that was the question that we tried to answer actually more definitively. So we worked basically alone. There was not really much support from colleagues in Seattle. They thought we were actually idiots pursuing a line of research that was doomed to fail. I remember very distinctly in 1966, I accidentally happened to sit next to the department chair of immunology in Seattle, Russ Weiser, on my way to New York to the transplantation meetings. And Russ kept pestering me all along this trip, which almost took 5 hours, telling me that transplantation would never come to pass. We would never be able to cross the barrier from one individual to another. So our future seemed dim.
Wow. But you made it, actually.
We made it, persevered.
But by the way, which field outside of hematology would have most influenced the thinking that was within your field at that time? For instance, were there more like fashionable discussions about other specific breakthrough or developments through seminars, conferences?
Well, you know, the seminars were far and in between. We had only money for attending one research meeting every year. So we either choose the transplantation meetings, the American Hematology Society meeting, or the experimental hematology meeting. What really influenced us a lot were developments in tissue typing. So we had very early on contact with Jan van Rode, especially in Leiden. Bob Epstein spent a few months there. And then we focused in dogs actually on developing DLA typing technology, which was, as you probably don't recall, it was very primitive at the time. So we spent an inordinate amount of time of creating antisera by cross-immunizing littermate dogs. And then taking these antisera and the trypan blue exclusion assay that Paul Terasaki in Los Angeles had developed, and then do systematic studies of pedigrees of animals, which turned out to be a disaster because of the fickleness of the testing system. And so eventually in 1967, before tossing the antibodies into the sink, we decided to do one last experiment, which it took us 2 hours to persuade Don Thomas to buy us the animals. So we bought 6 pairs of littermates, and then picked in each of the littermate pairs, we picked one donor and then one recipient that was clearly matched and one recipient that was clearly mismatched. So no questions. We tossed out all the fickle results and did then one final experiment where we coded the numbers of these animals. The secretary had the envelopes. We irradiated the 2 littermates on the same day. We gave them half of the marrow from the donor each, and then decided not to give them post-grafting immune suppression and see what happens. And as it turns out, the 6 mismatched littermates all succumbed to graft versus host disease or graft failure in the first 2 weeks. The matched ones lived each at least longer than 30 days, and then they began dying off from acute, subacute, or chronic graft versus host disease. So we learned two things. One is the typing is of utmost importance, the matching, but it isn't enough. And so you have to actually develop technologies to prevent this graft versus host disease. And so that actually was the very first demonstration of an in vitro assay predicting outcomes of a transplant. And so the fixation on HLA continued, actually. Later on, we recruited John Hansen to the Hutch. Now Effie Peterstow is continuing these studies, and typing, as you well know, has improved and is now nearly perfect with the development of molecular assays rather than serology and mixed leukocyte matching and so on. So that has been really a most influential part of our work.
But I guess there were no CRO which came and monitored whether the dog consented actually to being transplanted.
No. No.
And you were not mandated to declare the adverse events.
We did. We did. I mean, we from the very outset, our patients were clearly informed that. Especially
I was talking about the dogs.
For the dogs. Well, you mean the pet dog owners? We told them that there is a high risk, but if it succeeded, they would get them back, and all they needed to do is let us know what happened to the animals, and so that worked out really well.
Fantastic. So maybe we'll have a 2-minute break to see another video from someone you know very well.
Well, this has been heartwarming, the videos.
My name is Andrea Bacigalupo. I had the honor and the pleasure of meeting Rainer Storb in 1977 when I traveled to the Fred Hutch as a young postdoc to have an internship, which of course Rainer had organized. I was very surprised to learn that Rainer invited me to stay at his place together with his wife Beverly, so that I could have time to find a place to stay for the following months in the lovely house on the lake. In the following days, we went skiing together with Rainer on Mount Rainier, which is close to Seattle. Beautiful place. And it was great fun. Of course, I was full of admiration for everything Rainer had already done in 1977 in the dog model and then translated to the clinic. We still use, after so many years, the protocols that Rainer had developed in the animal model, for example, for GVH prophylaxis, for a conditioning regimen. And so I think we owe Rainer a great deal for what he has done for the field, what he has done for bone marrow transplantation, and especially for all of our patients. So thank you, Rainer, very much for everything and for your friendship.
Thank you, Andrea. So we just heard it, Rainer. You have trained hundreds, actually, of transplanters across the globe. And I think B&B didn't exist, apparently, for Andrea. So did you see yourself playing the role of influencing physicians in any way, moving towards this field of stem cell transplantation?
Yeah, I mean, I still remember most of the fellows and postdocs who came through the laboratory. The first European ones were Hans-Joachim Kolb from Munich, and Eliane Luckman from Paris, actually. And what I wanted to instill in these individuals was to do experiments who are well thought out, who have clear and simple readouts, that there's no equivocation, and to expect that 80% or more of the experiments they will be doing come out negatively. But then not to despair, because when thinking about a negative result, you oftentimes come up with actually something very, very positive that leads you to the next experiment. And I also taught them to be tenacious, not to be discouraged easily, but to reflect on, why things went not the way you thought they should have come out. I mean, biology is actually really complex. You're thinking out something in your mind, or based on in vitro studies in the lab, that something should work like this in vivo, but oftentimes, as I said, it doesn't come out that way. And the main thing is really to be honest with yourself, to accept the results the way they are, not to beautify them, and to be critical of yourself. And so those are the things that I try to convey to trainees. And in many of them, it has been extremely successful. And I'm just mentioning, Eliane and Hans Joachim, and we just heard also Andrea, and we heard previously Hilde Greinix and others. And so it's really gratifying to see their success. And frankly, to me, teaching young individuals to become good scientists is probably one of the more gratifying aspects of my work, apart from helping patients, of course, which has been a very, very high priority always.
And I can assure you, all of them are very, very grateful. But unfortunately, we are not able to display all the videos we were able to gather. So we spoke about the initial research you did, the passion, of course, the famous department or subdivision of transportation. But now I'm very interested actually in your relationship with patient, actually, and how looking at particular diseases like acute leukemia, aplastic anemia, has influenced the sort of questions that you've chosen to ask in your lab, but also in the clinical research at the bedside.
Well, I mean, as physician scientists in Seattle here, we, until 1998, did 3 months of attending physicians on service. And since then, it has been 2 months, and the third month was consultations, second opinions, and so on. So you are actually in the front lines for a good portion of the year, and you're encountering, patients with otherwise fatal diseases, and you want to help them. And so from the very outset, we had a lot of patients with aplastic anemia, which in the pre-ATG era was almost always immediately fatal. And so I spent a fair amount of time on working on that problem. We developed in monkeys the conditioning regimen that's still being used today, the 50x4 Cytoxin. And then in dogs later on, we developed the addition of the ATG. We were expecting rejections because of sensitization to minor histocompatibility agents based on studies we published in the 1960s and 1970s. And so we worked on figuring out how to overcome that. Developed eventually techniques to leukodeplete blood products, and then found serendipitously that irradiating the blood product eliminated sensitization to minor antigens almost completely. Developed the ATG cytoxin regimen. So that has now entered mainstream. And so the next frontier were leukemic patients. And of course, graft-versus-host disease prevention was a big item for all transplants. But in leukemia, the relapse was the big issue from the get-go. And so one of the problems was that early patients were all in full-blown refractory relapse. And so the relapse incidence was extremely high. Going to patients, transplanting patients in remission improved things. But today, that is the number one problem. We have, in the mini transplants that you mentioned a little earlier, we have a 35% 5-year relapse rate. And that almost always leads to death of the patient. And so what drives me now is figuring out how to improve on this. We can't go up with the intensity of the conditioning regimen. So our focus has, as of the last 10 years, been on using targeted radioimmunotherapy. We're fortunate to work with our radiation physicists at the university here to develop an isotope called astatine-211, short half-life, very powerful, short path lengths. And then another colleague, Scott Wilbur, helped us coupling it to any antibody using a boron cage. And that's now in clinical trial in hopes of decreasing the relapse rate. It may not be enough, and so we're currently working on a more innovative procedure, which I can't comment on yet because it's just entering the preclinical experimentation stage. So relapse is the big issue that is driven home to you when you transplant patients, and then the next thing you hear, a year later, the patient has relapsed, and that's almost always a death sentence. And so I'm driven by the experiences that I have with treating patients. It drives me to go back to the laboratory to figure out how to overcome this hurdle of relapse. So that's, and that's, I think, probably, given my age, is probably the last frontier that I want to still conquer.
Maybe we'll talk about this in a few years and we'll celebrate the success of this innovation. But now because we heard her name, we heard several times people in the videos mentioning your wife. They have mentioned your son. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about the contribution of your wife and the rest of your family during your career and to all what you've been telling us tonight.
Well, Melanie, of course, has had a tremendous influence on me. I met her in 1974, fortuitously, when she was a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Genetics. And a year later, she got an NIH postdoctoral fellowship that enabled her to come out to Seattle to work in the division of hematology. And from the get-go, Beverly is a very independent individual. From the get-go, we try to keep our research separate from each other so that I wouldn't tell her how to do experiments and she wouldn't tell me how to do experiments, although we did a few pieces of work together and have a number of publications with both of our names on them. We mentored at least 3, co-mentored at least 3 postdoctoral fellows, one of whom is Maciej Zauka, who is now the head of oncology in the University of Gdansk in Poland. One is Marco Milczarek, who is the director of the clinical director of bone marrow transplantation here at the IACH and the University of Washington. and one went to Australia, Paul Simmons. So we had a few people we co-mentored, but we support each other through the periods of time when stuff doesn't work out in the laboratory, for example. And then we talk it through and give each other encouragement. And so I think the influence that we exert on each other is more settled. It's not expressed in direct collaboration, but rather in thinking through failed experimentation and finding positive directions and helping each other that way. As for my son, he's not in research, and we wrote together a lot, at least 3 to 4 times a week in the same boat, and either with each other alone or in addition with a couple of friends in a 4-person rowing ship. So he and I are very close on that level.
So he didn't co-author one of the 1,400 papers you have published thus far?
No, he is not.
Because I didn't mention that you have more than 100,000 citations with 152H index, which is magic, I think, Rainer.
I was unaware of that.
Well, is there anything else you would like to add at this time, Rainer, especially something that you would have done differently in hindsight?
No, not really. I mean, I consider myself really fortunate in, first having chosen my first postdoctoral fellowship in Paris, which, apart from what I learned there in science, I mean, I worked with Jean Bernard, and I met Jean Dossé, who worked in the same building, who became a friend. And I experienced Paris in the early 60s, which was a magical city for me, at least, coming out of war-torn Germany. And then I think purely fortuitously, I made it to Seattle. And I must say, I came for a period of 3 years. Early on, I had a lot of doubts whether or not I would ever actually achieve anything with the work we were doing, to be quite frank, because we were so lonely. I mean, I can't really emphasize how lonely we felt. First of all, in this old hospital, where we were the only people doing research. And secondly, in the whole world, where there were only very, very few, a handful of groups really interested in this topic. So there were very few people to talk to. So the loneliness was amazing. But then after 3 years, I had a job offer in Germany with Ted Fliedner at the University of Ulm. I visited, and by that time we had made progress actually in the lab. And I could see a little bit of light at the end of this dark tunnel. And I decided to decline the offer. And when I came back down and said, well, I have money for another year to pay you. Is that okay? I said, yeah, I take my chances. And because I couldn't apply for research grants because I was still an alien. And I only got my first IACH grant in 1971, exactly on the day that I got my green card. Without the green card, you couldn't apply for NIH funding. And so I'm actually eternally grateful to the NIH to have supported me for that long time. But the other thing that happened is that Seattle began growing on me. I liked this beautiful environment here, the water, the mountains. I was a mountain climber and a skier. And I liked the people. They were very liberal, open-minded, and I still like them. It's still one of my preferred places in the United States, is the West Coast. And so I can't really think of things that I would have done differently. I sort of happened to slide into these positions more or less haphazard, to be honest, although driven by this desire to work in a laboratory where I could do work that would be useful eventually to human patients. And that was the main driver of staying here. I looked at a bunch of jobs in the United States, UCLA, Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, you name it. I always came back to Don. I said, Don, I looked at these jobs, a lot of administrative stuff, university politics. Can I stay here? And he said, yeah, sure. As long as you're willing to obtain research grant funding and don't mind it, you can stay forever. So I think that I did make the right decision. And am fortunate, I think, to have landed here in this town with the help of this incredible Fulbright scholarship, and that I can stay with the help of NIH funding that has accompanied me, and it will end in 2025 when I'm 90 years old. I will stop working, and because that's when my last project grant will end.
But we just heard a few minutes ago about hopefully your successful future innovation to try to decrease the incidence of relapse after transplant. On a broader scale, I would say, what are your hopes today for the future of hematology?
Well, I mean, there's benign hematology, there's malignant hematology, right? And my hunch is that the malignant hematology is really the more weighty one, because there are all these patients with leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma. And I hope that the ideal hope is that by doing and trying to figure out what are the drivers of these malignancies, and is there a way of switching them off? And so far, unfortunately, that hasn't panned out for any of the diseases. I mean, look at AML. We know FLT3 is one of the drivers, and we have FLT3 inhibitors, and yet they don't cure the disease. So I'm hoping that we can make stem cell transplantation safer. We still haven't entirely figured out how to prevent acute GVHD. We're better there, actually, already. We got it down to a very low dangerous level, but we haven't figured out how to get rid of the chronic one. And so I hope for somebody to develop some insight how to turn that off. That's what I'm banking on. And perhaps somebody more clever than I am, and more clever than most people who are currently established in the field, will figure that out. And once that has happened, I could imagine that transplantation would become a standard of care for a lot of these diseases. I mean, we have CAR T cells, okay, but do they, in all patients, lead to a full cure? So far, not. I mean, the first CLL patients were just reported living 10 years without recurrence, but those are the exceptions rather than the rule, right? And so I'm hoping that by getting control of the graft versus host reaction, which so far has actually eluded us, that somebody will figure that out. And then transplantation would become really standard of care that can be conducted, hopefully, in really good non-university-based hospitals also. That's what I'm hoping. Same thing is true for sickle cell disease. We have gene therapy, but I'm always a little concerned about that, messing around with the hematopoietic system by introducing gene modifications. Maybe CRISPR will do this, but I don't know, actually. So I'm hoping that we will have in the future better control of graft versus host disease. Let it go, let it exert its graft versus tumor effect, and then turn it off. Well, that's going to be succeeding by somebody's ingenious insights. I don't know, but I'm hoping for it.
Now I have one last but important question, and actually hundreds of people watching us today are waiting for this answer, is what is your advice for the younger generation, you know, if they want to become a giant like yourself?
Well, I guess you're talking about hematology oncology fellows, right?
Sure.
I think the first thing is to pick a good mentor. I think that's an important part. I think somebody charismatic who you connect with, you can discuss with, you can disagree with. Then you have to be incredibly curious. And curiosity is really what drove me. And you have to be tenacious. You have to be able to take defeat, which comes when you're an experimental worker, comes almost on a daily basis. I mean, I've had so many failed experiments, and then have the ability to think through, why did it fail? What went wrong? What can I learn from this failure? And not to be discouraged and say, well, I give up. You have to actually take it on the chin and being able to keep standing and thinking. So I think those would be, in my mind, the important ingredients. And then, of course, here in the United States, life is a little different than in Europe, where you have firm salaries. You have to be able to live with some uncertainty. I wrote my very first grant in 1962, the NATO Science Fellowship application to be able to work in Paris. And since 1962, December 62, I've been working with the support of research grants. Right now, my salary is 50% supported by research grants, 25% by clinical income, and 25% I'm getting from the center. So you have to have that kind of, well, boldness in thinking that I'll be successful. I can live on this with this uncertainty. I don't have to have a firm salary. Those are the kind of things that any investigator or any young investigator actually is facing in the United States. As I said, in Europe, it may be different in that you have institutional salaries that are set by the state or by the city or by whoever runs your university. Here, it's different, and you have to have that kind of, if you wish, daring to say, well, okay, I'm going to be successful. I'll work on.
Well, I can't add anything more except saying a big thank you. But this big thank you, I'll leave it to another of your friends who will make the conclusion of this webinar, unless you would like to add something.
No, I'd just like to thank you, Mohammed, of organizing all of this. I really appreciate your friendship. I think you and I first met in Marseille, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct, almost 20 years ago.
Yes, when I visited Didier and Christian Chabanot. And ever since then, I have admired how you have handled yourself and have actually been able to occupy a very important position in French and European sciences. And so, again, thank you for selecting me as your first candidate.
I feel very humbled with your comments, and I did not select. It was a group decision, unanimous group decision. So thank you again. It was a true privilege for me to moderate this first episode of Standing on the Shoulders of the Giants. And we are very grateful to the big giant, Dr. Rainer Storb. But let's get this last video. And in the meantime, I would like to thank all of you watching live today. We are on the 17th of February, 2022. Thank you for your loyalty. And thank you for listening to this broadcast, which will be available, of course, open access to everybody on the Academy website. Let's launch the last video. Thank you very much, Rainer. Please stay safe and keep well. And I hope we'll meet very soon, whenever possible, in Paris, and enjoy a nice dinner with some good drinks.
Thank you.
Dear colleagues, thank you for letting me participate in this first IACH celebration of one of the true giants in our field, as I cannot think of a more worthy candidate to receive this honor than Dr. Rainer Storb. Back in 1983, I was given the opportunity to do my hematology oncology fellowship at the Fred Hutch. And once I was there and having the opportunity to be around Rainer, I quickly benefited from his unlimited fountain of wisdom, kindness, and scientific integrity flowing so freely from his innovative mind in an endless stream, which actually to this day continues to provide me with meaningful aha moments. But what I also learned from Rainer in the 40 years he has been a mentor to me is the importance of always trying to join scientific integrity and studies seamlessly with clinical medicine, which, in my opinion, he did better than anyone. And in that process, he managed to make himself readily available to students and staff and patients alike. And I can think of no one mentor that I have encountered in the 50 years that I have been doing stem cell transplants who has done this more elegantly than Rainer. I do know of patients from all over the world, including some of my own patients, who after finding Rainer's email address reached out to him for advice about their conditions and whether they should have a transplant, and with every one of those receiving a comprehensive and thoughtful answer back, which together with Rainer's many other qualities is what makes him so unique among the other early giants in our field, as regardless of who asks him for advice, an unknown patient, and former fellow, a transplant colleague, Rainer always make sure to answer these many queries in a prompt and thoughtful way. So thank you, Rainer, for all you have done for our patients and for us, and for having made allogeneic cell therapy as available and safe as it is today, thereby having played a major role in saving the lives of countless patients. Thank you.